Manure, wet wool, and cheap gin. That was the smell of a ruined reputation. Beja knew she had no business standing in the Duke's private paddock boots, sinking into the muck, staring down a half-mad gelding that already broken 2 men's collarbones. She didn't want glory. She wanted the 50 guineas heavy in the nobleman's pocket. The wager was simple: survive 3 minutes in the saddle. She intended to do a hell of a lot more than survive. Caluses snagged against the rough wool of her pockets as Beja Kelly stood in the courtyard of Ashburn Hall. The estate was too large, too quiet. It smelled of damp stone, expensive pipe tobacco, and the distinct cloying scent of generational wealth. To Beja, it smelled like a way out. She shifted her weight. Her left boot leaked. A steady seep of icy puddle water wicked through the worn leather, chilling her toes. She ignored it. You didn't complain about cold feet when you were 3 weeks behind on rent, and the landlord had taken to lingering by your door at dusk. Across the cobblestones Taryn West, the Duke's head groom, polished a silver snaffle bit with a rag that was cleaner than Bezia's best shirt. He didn't look up. He had already told her she was wasting her time. His Grace don't hire women, and he certainly don't hire strays off the Brighton Road. Beja didn't leave. She stood like a post driven into the ground, shoulders hunched against the biting November wind, watching the heavy oak doors of the main house. When Henry Cavendish, the Duke of Ashburn, finally emerged, he didn't sweep out with dramatic flair. He walked like a man who found the world incredibly tedious. He was tall, but he slouched slightly as if the sheer weight of his title tired his spine. He wore a dark wool coat tailored, so perfectly it looked poured over his shoulders, and his boots spotless. Course clicked sharply against the stones. He didn't notice her at first. Why would he? She was a smudge of grey and brown against the stables. West, Henry said. His voice was a low rumble, rougher than Beja expected from a man who likely owned a valet just to iron his morning paper. Tell me the farrier isn't delaying again. Tomorrow morning, Your Grace, West said, dropping the rag and touching his cap. Roads are washed out past the toll bridge. Henry exhaled through his nose. He pulled a silver case from his pocket, snapping it open with a sharp metallic click that made one of the nearby thoroughbreds prick its ears. He extracted a cheroot, clamped it between his teeth, and struck a match. The sharp sulphur smell cut through the damp air. As the flame flared, his eyes caught movement. Beja had stepped out of the shadow of the overhang. Henry paused, the match burning precariously close to his gloved fingers. He shook it out, tossing the smoking wood into a puddle. West, why is there a child in my yard? Not a child, Your Grace, Beja said. Her voice cracked. She hadn't spoken since dawn. She cleared her throat, tasting copper and morning breath, and tried again. I'm 24, and I'm here for the breaker's position. Henry stared at her. His gaze wasn't calculating or intrigued. It was entirely blank. He looked at her battered felt hat, the oversized men's coat she wore tied at the waist with a piece of baling twine, and the mud caked to her shins. I don't run a charity, Henry said, turning back to his groom. Send her to the kitchens if she's hungry, then see her off the grounds. I don't want soup, Beja snapped. Her hands formed fists in her pockets. The sudden spike of anger felt good. It warmed the blood in her chest. I heard you fired your last 2 breakers. I heard you have a yard full of green 2-year-olds and a stable full of problem horses that nobody wants to touch. Henry stopped. He turned slowly, the cheroot clamped in his jaw. A faint plume of blue smoke drifted up past his eye. You heard? Yes. From whom? The taverns in town. Men talk when their arms are in slings. Beja held his gaze. Her stomach was a tight, painful knot of anxiety, but she didn't blink. I can back any horse in this yard. I have softer hands than your heavy-fisted grooms, and I don't give up when I get dumped. West scoffed loudly. Your Grace, she's touched in the head. She showed up at dawn demanding to see you. Henry took the cheroot from his mouth. He looked Beja up and down again. This time the dismissal was heavy, suffocating. It was the look of a man who dealt with ledgers clear's throat and logic, and saw only a bad investment standing before him. You weigh what, 8 stone? Henry asked. You don't have the leverage to hold a draft cross, let alone sit a bucking thoroughbred. Go home, girl, before you get yourself killed on my property, and leave me with the paperwork. He turned on his heel. He was leaving. The opportunity was evaporating into the cold morning air. I heard about the grey, Bajia said loudly. Henry stopped. His shoulders stiffened. West hissed. Shut your mouth, girl. Bajia stepped forward, boots squelching. I heard you bought a hunter at Tattersall's, a massive iron grey, paid a fortune for him. And I heard he's put 3 of your men in the dirt and you haven't been able to put a saddle on him in a month. Henry turned back around. His jaw was tight. The absolute boredom in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a cold, hard irritation. Is that right? Henry murmured, stepping toward her. Up close he smelled of cedar wood and that sharp tobacco, the dark circles under his eyes. He didn't look like a pampered lord. He looked exhausted. Yes, Bajia said, forcing her chin up. You're keeping him locked in the back stalls, wasting feed, letting him rot because your pride won't let you sell him at a loss, and your men are too terrified to open his door. Henry studied her. The silence stretched heavy and dangerous. The wind rattled the loose shingles on the stable roof. You think it's a matter of pride? Henry asked softly. I think it's a matter of competence, Bajia countered. 50 guineas. That's your price for a breaker. I'll ride the grey. If I sit him, you pay me, and you give me the job. Henry laughed. It was a short, humorless sound. And if he caves your ribs in, then you can drag me out to the road, and it won't be your problem. Henry looked at West, then back at Bajia. He dropped his cheroot and crushed it slowly beneath the heel of his boot. Fine, Henry said. The word dropped like a stone. You want to break your neck for 50 guineas, I won't stop you. The walk to the isolation stalls felt like a march to the gallows. Bajia followed the Duke and his head groom past the main courtyard, leaving the warmth of the occupied stables behind. The air grew colder here, trapped between the high stone walls of the older medieval section of the estate. Weeds choked the cobblestones. No one came back here unless they had to. Her bravado was leaking away with every step. Her knees felt weak, a slight tremor shaking her thighs. 50 guineas. It was a fortune. It was a cottage, a winter's worth of coal, a doctor for her father's lungs. It was survival. But as the sore, sharp sting of concentrated ammonia hit her nose, reality crashed down on her. They stopped before a heavy wooden door bound in black iron. The top half was shut tight, barring any light from entering the stall. Deep, uneven gouges scarred the wood on the outside, as if something had tried to kick its way through the solid oak. His name is Balthazar, Henry said. He stood a few paces back, his hands clasped behind him. He watched her face closely, looking for the inevitable hesitation. But the men call him Ruin. He's an Irish draft cross, 6.3 hands of pure malice. Bajia stared at the door. From inside she heard a sound that made her stomach turn over a low guttural sigh, followed by the heavy rhythmic thud of a massive hoof pacing against the straw. Thump. It wasn't the sound of a horse. It sounded like a caged tiger. Why did you buy him? Bajia asked, her voice quieter now. He cleared a 6-foot ditch in the hunting field in Leicestershire. Henry said dryly. He flew over it like a bird. I wanted a horse that could jump the stone boundary wall on the south estate. No horse has ever cleared it. And on the day after I paid for him, he realized he didn't have to tolerate a rider if he simply chose to crush them against the nearest wall. Henry gestured to the door. He is yours to saddle. West will not help you. I will not help you. If you cry out, I will have West pull you out, but the wager is forfeit. Bajia licked her lips. They tasted like salt and dirt. She looked at West, who was holding a heavy leather halter and a lead rope. He held them out to her, his expression a mix of pity and grim expectation. She took the leather. It was stiff and cold. Are you backing out? Henry asked. He didn't sound triumphant. He just sounded tired. There's no shame in it. He's a killer. Bajia looked at the Duke. She saw the absolute certainty in his eyes, the certainty that she was going to fail because everyone failed him. He lived in a world where problems could be bought, sold, or locked behind oak doors. She lived in a world where you either faced the teeth or you starved. "I need a bucket of oats," Bezier said to West, and opened the top door. "Let the light in." West hesitated, looking at Henry. The Duke gave a curt nod. West unlatched the top half of the heavy door and swung it open. Dust motes danced furiously in the sudden shaft of grey daylight. Instantly, a massive head lunged into the opening. Bezier flinched, stepping back. The horse was enormous. His coat was a dark bruised iron grey, thick with dried mud and sweat, because no groom had dared to brush him. His ears were pinned flat against his skull, disappearing entirely. His eyes were wide-rimmed with frantic rolling white. He snapped his teeth at the empty air, the sound like a steel trap clamping shut, then threw his head up, striking the heavy wooden door frame with a dull thud. He didn't care about the pain. He was pure blind rage and panic. Bezier stared at him. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She was terrified. It was a raw primal fear that urged her to drop the halter and run back to the turnpike. But beneath the fear, as she watched the horse frantically in the small square of light, she saw something else. The whites of his eyes weren't just angry. They were wide with the same desperate, trapped energy she felt every time the rent collector knocked. He was isolated in the dark. He was cornered. 3 minutes in the saddle, Bezier said, her voice shaking slightly. She didn't look at Henry. "If you can get it on him," Henry murmured. Bezier took the bucket of oats West handed her. She unlatched the bottom door. "Don't do it, lass," West muttered softly. Bezier slid the bolt back. The heavy iron groaned. She pushed the door open and stepped into the gloom. The smell inside was overwhelming. Decaying straw, rank urine, and the hot metallic scent of an angry animal. As soon as Bezier closed the lower door behind her, the light shifted. The stall felt no larger than a coffin. In the corner, Ruin stopped pacing. He turned his massive bulk toward her. The sheer size of him stole the breath from her lungs. His chest was a wall of muscle. His neck was thick and crusted, scarred with old bite marks from herd scuffles. He lowered his head. He didn't make a sound. No whinny. No snort. Just a deadly silent focus. Bezier froze. She didn't try to make soothing noises. She didn't hold her hand out for him to sniff. That was a good way to lose fingers. She kept her hands low, the halter in one, the bucket in the other. "All right, you ugly bastard," she whispered. Her voice was steady, even though her hands shook. "I know you hate them. They hate you," Ruin lunged. It was horrifyingly fast. 1/500 elb of muscle exploding forward. Bezier didn't think. She reacted on poor instinct. She threw herself to the side, slamming her shoulder hard against the rough stone wall of the stall. Pain flared down her collarbone. The horse's teeth snapped empty air right where her face had been. His massive shoulder brushed her coat as he spun, intending to kick. Bezier shoved the heavy wooden bucket of oats directly at his hindquarters. The bucket struck his hock. Ruin startled, kicking out blindly. The hoof shattered the bucket. Oats exploded in a beige cloud raining down on the filthy straw. Bezier didn't retreat. If she backed up to the door, she was prey. She pushed forward, stepping directly into his space, grabbing a handful of his thick, tangled mane near the withers, where he couldn't easily bite or kick. Ruin threw his head up, dragging her off her feet for a second. Her boots scrambled in the muck. Her bruised shoulder screamed, but she held on, twisting her fist into the coarse hair. "Quit it," she barked, putting all the authority she could muster from the pit of her stomach into the shout. It wasn't a sweet whisper. It was a command. The horse froze. He trembled violently, his skin twitching under her knuckles. He was waiting for the whip. He was waiting for the heavy boots and the yelling men with pitchforks. Instead, Bezier just stood there, breathing heavily, hanging onto his mane. She didn't hit him. She just anchored him. They stood in the semi-darkness for a long minute. The only sound was the harsh, rasping breath of the horse and Bezier's own ragged panting. Sweat trickled down the back of her neck, icy in the damp air. The texture of his mane was greasy, stiff with dirt. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Bajia slid her right hand up his neck. Ruin flinched, his ears pinning back again, his head tossing. "No," she said firmly. She kept her hand there, a heavy, warm, unmoving pressure. Through the open top door, she could hear West muttering something to the Duke. She ignored them. The world outside this 12 by 12 box didn't exist. There was only the heat of the horse, the smell of ammonia, and the beating of their hearts. It took 10 minutes to get the halter over his ears. Every time she moved the leather, he jerked away, pulling her with him. Her knuckles scraped against the stone wall, tearing the skin. She bled onto the leather. She didn't care. When the buckle finally clicked into place, Bajia dropped her forehead against the thick muscle of his shoulder. She was exhausted, and she hadn't even brought him out of the stall yet. "All right," she panted, gripping the lead rope. "Let's go show the lordling how to walk in the mud." She turned and kicked the lower latch open. When Bajia stepped out into the grey light of the courtyard, looked like she had been in a brawl. There was a smear of dirt and blood across her cheek from her torn knuckles. Her coat was covered in pale oats and filth. She was limping slightly from where she had slammed into the wall, but behind her, at the end of the taut lead rope, came the beast. Ruin stepped out of the isolation stall. The light hit his iron grey coat, highlighting the massive coiled tension in his muscles. He tossed his head, a violent snap that lifted Bajia onto her toes, but she didn't let go. She jerked the rope back hard. "Walk," she snapped. The horse snorted a wet rattling sound, but he took a step forward. Henry Cavendish stood exactly where she had left him. The boredom was entirely gone from his face. His dark eyes tracked her slow, limping progress across the cobblestones, moving from her bleeding hand up to the wild rolling eyes of the horse. "Fetch a saddle, Mr. West," Bajia called out, her voice raspy but ringing clear in the cold air. She didn't stop walking until she reached the center of the yard, the horse blowing hot, nervous breath against the back of her neck. She looked directly at the Duke. "And make sure the girth isn't rotten. I don't intend to die because your tack room is as neglected as your horse's." Henry's jaw worked. For the first time all morning, a faint, dangerous smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Bring her the McClellan saddle, West," Henry ordered softly. He stepped closer, his boots immaculate against the muck, his eyes locked onto Bajia. "Let's see if she can keep her seat." West dumped the saddle onto the top rung of the paddock fence. It hit the wood with a heavy, dead thud. The saddle was a monstrosity of thick, unyielding leather and brass hardware built for the cavalryman who expected to ride through artillery fire. It smelled of rancid tallow and neglect. Bajia tied Ruin to the heavy iron ring on the oak post in the center of the yard. She didn't leave him enough slack to turn his head and bite her. The horse stood with his legs splayed, muscles twitching under his filthy coat like flayed nerves. He was sweating despite the biting cold. A thick white lather was already building between his hind legs and along his neck. "You're going to need a leg up," West said, keeping a very careful distance. He held the girth strap like it was a live snake. "If you touch me, he'll explode," Bajia said, her voice tight. Her hands were throbbing where the skin had been scraped from her knuckles. "Slide the saddle over the fence slowly." Henry watched from the edge of the muck. He hadn't moved. His dark wool coat was perfectly still in the wind, but his eyes tracked her every movement. He was waiting for the inevitable crack of bone. He had seen strong men with biceps the size of Bajia's waist, thrown like rag dolls by this animal. He found himself fascinated by the sheer stubborn stupidity of the woman. She was shivering. The oversized coat she wore was soaked through at the hem, dragging in the mud, and she favored her right shoulder when she reached for the heavy leather. She wasn't a hero. She was a desperate stray, and desperation, in Henry's experience, usually led to catastrophic mistakes. Bajia hoisted the saddle. It was absurdly heavy. Pain shot down her bruised collarbone, sharp and bright, but she gritted her teeth, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She let the saddle hover over Ruin's back for a fraction of a second before dropping it gently into place. The horse flinched violently, dropping his spine and scooting sideways. His iron-shod hooves scraped harshly against the cobblestones, striking sparks. Basia didn't back away. She stayed pressed against his shoulder, moving with him, her left hand keeping a vice grip on the halter. "Whoa!" She breathed entirely out of breath. "Whoa, you miserable brute!" She reached under his belly for the girth. The smell of hot, angry horse filled her lungs, a sharp, pungent musk that tasted like dirt. Her fingers brushed the coarse hair of his underside, and Ruin snapped a hind leg forward, aiming a cow kick directly at her ribs. Basia caught the movement in her peripheral vision and slammed her elbow hard into his ribs before the hoof could connect. It wasn't a punishing blow, just enough to throw his balance off. The horse scrambled, slamming his foot back onto the ground with a frustrated snort. She snatched the leather strap, hauled it up, and shoved the heavy brass buckle through the first hole. Ruin immediately bloated his stomach, filling his massive lungs with air to keep the strap loose. It was an old trick. Basia leaned her forehead against his sweaty shoulder, closing her eyes. She was so tired, her legs felt hollow. "West." Henry's voice cut through the damp air. "Tell me you have a physician on call. Dr. Eris is in the village, Your Grace. It'll take an hour to fetch him. Then we'll need a cart to carry her down," Henry said dryly. Basia's eyes snapped open. The exhaustion in her limbs was suddenly burned away by a fresh hot surge of spite. She jammed her knees sharply into the horse's bloated belly. Ruin exhaled with an indignant grunt. In that split second of deflation, Basia hauled the leather strap up 3 more notches, securing it tightly. The buckle pinched the pad of her thumb, drawing a fresh bead of dark blood, but she didn't care. The saddle was set. She backed away slowly. The horse stood locked in place, his ears pinned flat against his skull, his eyes rolling white. He looked like a powder keg waiting for a spark. 3 minutes, Basia said, turning her head just enough to look at the Duke. Her chest heaved. The smear of blood and dirt on her face made her look wild, feral. "Have West fetch a pocket watch." Henry slowly reached into his waistcoat. He pulled out a gold hunter watch, the chain clinking faintly in the quiet yard. He clicked it open. The brass face caught the dull November light. "The moment your weight is in the stirrup," Henry said, his voice dropping its cynical edge, replaced by something entirely serious. "If you fall, do not try to stand up immediately. Roll toward the fence. He will try to trample you." Basia didn't answer. She turned back to the horse. She didn't mount from the ground. She couldn't. The horse was nearly 17 hands high, and her legs were too short to reach the iron stirrup without bouncing, which would only trigger him faster. Instead, she grabbed the heavy iron ring on the wooden post, hauled herself up onto the bottom rail of the fence, and balanced precariously above the mud. Ruin watched her, his head turned slightly, the whites of his eyes glowing. Basia gathered the heavy leather reins into her left hand, twisting them through her fingers so they wouldn't slip. She grabbed a fistful of coarse mane. She didn't pray. Praying hadn't kept the landlord away, and it wouldn't keep this horse from trying to kill her. She pushed off the fence and swung her right leg over the saddle. Gravity seized her, dropping her weight into the stiff leather seat. For one heartbeat, the world was perfectly terrifyingly still. The wind seemed to stop. West held his breath. Henry stared, the gold watch ticking loudly in the palm of his hand. Then the earth exploded. Ruin didn't rear. Rearing was for show. Ruin dropped his head between his front knees, rounded his massive back into a rigid arch, and launched himself entirely off the ground. The impact of his hooves hitting the earth shattered the silence. The jarring force shot straight up Basia's spine, rattling the teeth in her skull. Her breath was violently punched out of her lungs. Before she could inhale, he twisted in midair, throwing his hindquarters to the right, while his shoulders slammed to the left. It was a vicious, calculated move designed to snap a rider's balance and send them flying into the stone walls of the yard. Basia lost her right stirrup instantly. Her boot swung wildly. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded veins, but she didn't scream. She clamped her thighs against the saddle flaps, her muscles screaming in sudden, agonizing protest, and buried her hands deep into his tangled mane. She became a burr, a parasite. She threw every ounce of elegant riding technique she knew out the window. She wasn't trying to look good. She was trying to survive. 1 minute. West yelled over the thunder of hooves, his voice cracking with panic. Ruin hit the ground again and immediately lunged forward, charging blindly across the yard. The mud slicked his hooves. He slid, nearly going down on his knees before catching his balance and bucking again. Bashia's head snapped back. Her hat flew off, swallowed by the mud. The cold air whipped her hair into her eyes, stinging like needles. She tasted dirt. The world was a violent, blurring carousel of grey sky, brown earth, and the black iron of the paddock fence rushing toward her. He was heading straight for the timber. He intended to scrape her off. "Pull him," Henry shouted, stepping forward, his detached composure entirely shattered. He dropped his cigar. "Pull his head up!" Basia couldn't pull his head up. She didn't have the leverage. She had 80 lb of body weight against 500 lb of rage. As the heavy oak fence rapidly closed in on her left side, Basia did the only thing she could. She kicked her left foot out of the stirrup, pulled her leg high up onto the saddle pad, and shoved her boot hard against the passing fence rail. The violent friction tore the leather sole of her boot, but the force shoved the horse's shoulders away from the wood. They careened off the fence, scraping the heavy brass stirrup against the timber with a horrific screeching tear. Ruin squealed a high, demonic sound of pure fury. He stopped bucking forward and started spinning. He planted his front feet and whipped his hindquarters around in tight, dizzying circles. Centrifugal force tore at Basia. Her grip on his mane began to slip. Her knuckles, already bleeding, smeared slick red across his grey neck. Her thighs were burning, trembling violently under the strain. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the intense nausea rising in her throat. 50 guineas, she thought the words repeating like a frantic drumbeat in her skull. 50 guineas rent medicine coal. She locked her jaw. She dug the heel of her one stirruped boot deep into his side and hauled back on the left rein with everything she had, bending his neck around until his nose nearly touched her knee. Deprived of his balance, Ruin stumbled. He broke out of the spin chest, heaving his sides, expanding and contracting like a bellows. He didn't stop, but the violent bone-breaking bucks turned into a stiff, jarring crow, hop around the perimeter of the yard. Each impact was agony on Basia's bruised shoulder, but she was still in the saddle. 2 minutes, West hollered, hanging over the fence, now his face pale. Henry stood frozen, staring at the woman on the horse. He had seen cavalry officers, men decorated for bravery at Waterloo, quit after 30 seconds on a horse like this. They surrendered to the pain, to the fear. But this small, half-starved girl with a bleeding face and ruined boots simply refused to be dislodged. She wasn't fighting the horse with strength. She was outlasting him with pure miserable endurance. She was as stubborn and damaged as the beast she was riding. The realization hit Henry like a physical blow. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who yielded to him, who yielded to money, to titles, to difficulty. He had built a cynical armored shell around himself, convinced that everyone had a breaking point that was easily reached. Basia Kelly was shattering that shell with every jarring impact of hooves on mud. Ruin was tiring. The explosive energy was draining out of him, replaced by a heavy sullen exhaustion. His coat was black with sweat. He dragged his hooves, head hanging low, blowing thick ropes of spit from his lips. He came to a shuddering halt in the dead center of the yard. He stood there, feet planted wide, completely spent. His massive sides heaved violently. Basia didn't move. She couldn't. Her fingers were locked in his mane in a death grip. Her muscles had cramped so hard they felt like petrified wood. Her chest rose and fell in jagged, gasping breaths that sounded loud in the sudden eerie silence of the courtyard. "Time," Henry said. His voice was hoarse. He snapped the gold watch shut. The click echoed. "That's 3 minutes." Basia slowly turned her head. Her hair was plastered to her sweat-soaked forehead. She looked at the Duke, her eyes completely glazed, her mouth hanging open as she fought for air. Slowly, painfully, she unwrapped her bleeding fingers from the horse's mane. She kicked her left foot free of the stirrup, leaned her weight over the horse's sweating shoulder, and simply slid off. She hit the mud and her legs instantly buckled. She didn't fall entirely, catching herself on her hands and knees in the freezing muck. The cold water soaked through her trousers instantly, but she couldn't find the strength to stand. She just knelt there, head hanging, coughing violently as her lungs burned. West rushed forward with a lead rope, snatching Ruin's halter. The horse didn't even flinch. He just dropped his heavy head, thoroughly beaten by his own exhaustion. Footsteps approached. Slow, deliberate clicks on the wet stones. Henry stopped in front of her. Bezier stared at the immaculate, polished leather of his boots, now splattered with mud. She forced her arms to work. She pushed herself up, shaking violently, until she was kneeling upright. She looked up at him. Henry Cavendish stared down at her. The apathy was gone. The aristocratic boredom had been burned away. In its place was something intense, sharp, and deeply unsettled. He reached into his heavy coat pocket. He pulled out a small, heavy leather purse. He didn't hand it to her. He knelt down the wet mud, instantly ruining the knees of his bespoke trousers. He brought himself down to her eye level. The scent of his cedarwood tobacco washed over her, cutting through the smell of sweat and horse. 50 guineas. Henry said quietly, placing the heavy purse into her trembling, bleeding hand. His fingers brushed hers. They were warm. And the breaker's position is yours, if you want it. Bezier gripped the leather purse. The weight of the gold coins inside felt heavier than the saddle. She looked into his dark eyes, seeing the crack in his polished armor. "I'll be here at dawn," she rasped. Henry didn't smile, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. "I don't doubt it." Morning tasted like old copper and bruised bone. Bezier woke before the sun, her body entirely locked up. When she tried to push the thin wool blanket off her chest, her right shoulder screamed with a sharp, tearing heat. She lay staring at the water stains on the low plaster ceiling of her rented room, mapping the fresh damage. Her ribs throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. Her thighs felt as though they had been beaten with an iron rod. She forced herself to sit up. It took 3 tries. She didn't look in the cracked mirror over the wash basin. She already knew the damage. Instead, she wrapped a strip of clean linen tightly around her bleeding knuckles, pulled on a stiff, dry pair of trousers, and drank a cup of water that tasted faintly of tin. The 50 guineas sat in a wooden box under her floorboards. She could have stayed in bed. She could have bought a week's worth of coal, a bottle of laudanum, and slept for 3 days. But the memory of the Duke kneeling in the mud, staring at her with something close to actual respect gnawed at her. Henry Cavendish didn't hand out respect. He bought people, used them, and dismissed them. She walked the 3 miles to Ashbourne Hall in the dark. West was already turning the carriage horses out into the lower pasture when she limped into the yard. He stopped holding a leather halter and stared at her. "You look like a corpse, miss," he said flatly. "Good morning to you too, Terrin," Basha grunted, heading straight for the tack room. She didn't ride Ruin that day or the next. The romantic notion of taming a wild beast with a single ride was a lie sold in cheap penny dreadfuls. Breaking a horse like Ruin was a trench war. It was fought in inches in the freezing mud day after day. Basha spent the first week doing nothing but groundwork in the round pen. She stood in the center with a long lunge line, making the massive grey gelding run circles around her. He bucked, he charged. He reared and struck out with his front hooves, his iron shoes whistling past her face. She just stood her ground, snapping the whip behind his hocks, forcing him to keep moving until his lungs burned and his arrogance faltered. She demanded his attention. When his ears flicked away toward the main yard, she popped the whip. "Look at me. Respect my space." It was exhausting, brutal work. Her hands grew new layers of calluses over the torn blisters. She smelled permanently of horse sweat and damp wool. On the 8th day, Henry finally came down to the pens. He had watched her from the library window all week, a silent shadow behind the heavy velvet drapes. He found himself abandoning his ledgers, his estate planning to watch a half-starved woman fight a war in the mud. It irritated him. He was a man of logic and numbers, and there was no logic in her persistence. The air was bitterly cold, the sky a bruised heavy grey. Henry approached the wooden fence just as Beja brought Ruin to a halt. The horse stood sweating, head lowered, chest heaving. Beja leaned heavily on the wooden handle of the whip. "You came back," Henry said. Beja didn't flinch. She turned her head, wiping a smear of dirty sweat from her forehead with the back of her sleeve. "I said I would. People say many things when they are desperate," Henry murmured, leaning his forearms on the top rail. He wore a heavy charcoal topcoat, the collar turned up against the wind. 50 guineas is enough to buy passage to America, or at least enough to keep you drunk and fed in London for a year. "And when the year is up?" Beja asked, her voice raspy. She unclipped the line from Ruin's halter and let him wander to the water trough. "I end up right back where I started. 50 guineas delay starvation, your grace. A steady wage prevents it." Henry studied her. The bruising on her cheek had faded to an ugly mottled yellow. "You are remarkably pragmatic for a woman who chooses to sit on dynamite for a living. I don't have the luxury of being anything else." Beja walked to the fence, stopping a few feet from him. She was acutely aware of the contrast between them. He smelled of wealth, clean soap, sharp cologne, rich tobacco. She smelled like a barn. "Is there a reason you're down here, or did you just come to critique my financial planning?" A faint, genuine smile touched the corners of Henry's mouth. It changed his entire face, erasing the cynical lines around his eyes. "I brought you something." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, heavy glass jar with a metal lid. He set it on the flat top of the fence post. "Arnica and camphor," Henry said. "My grandmother's recipe. It smells vile, but it pulls the bruising out of deep muscle." Beja stared at the jar. She didn't reach for it. Her stomach gave a strange tight flutter that had nothing to do with fear. It was an uncomfortable sensation. She was used to men offering her insults, pity, or threats. She didn't know what to do with a quiet, observant kindness from a man who held her livelihood in his hands. "Why?" she asked suspiciously. "Because a crippled breaker is of no use to me," Henry replied smoothly. The smile vanished, replaced by his usual guarded mask. But he didn't look away. "And because I find myself entirely invested in seeing you win this particular fight. Use it, Kelly." He turned and walked back toward the great house, his boots cutting sharp lines into the frost-hardened earth. Beja watched him go. Then she picked up the jar. The glass was still warm from his pocket. December arrived with teeth. The ground froze solid, turning the mud of the paddock into jagged, ankle-breaking ruts. Ruin was no longer trying to kill her daily, but the truce was fragile. He allowed Beja to saddle him. He allowed her to ride him out of the yard, but he was a coiled spring. Every shadow, every snapping twig in the woods made him drop his hindquarters and bolt. He didn't want to amble. He wanted to run until his heart exploded. "He needs a job," Beja told Henry one morning. They were standing in the main barn, the smell of hot bran mash and sweet molasses heavy in the air. "He's bored. Groundwork isn't enough anymore. He needs a stretch of open ground." Henry was inspecting the stitching on a bridle. He paused. "The ground is iron hard. If he runs off with you and trips, he'll shatter a cannon bone and break your neck." "He won't trip. He knows where his feet are," Beja argued. She stepped closer, invading his space just a fraction. It was a habit she was developing, pushing back against his authority in small physical ways. "You bought him to hunt. You bought him to jump. If you keep him boxed in this yard, he's going to revert." Henry looked down at her. He noticed, not for the first time, the stubborn set of her jaw and the sharp intelligence in her eyes. "Fine. Saddle him. I'll ride out with you." An hour later, they left the estate grounds. Henry rode a magnificent dark bay thoroughbred, a horse that moved with fluid, arrogant grace and obeyed his lightest touch. Beja rode the Hurricane. Ruin was a nightmare. He sidestepped, chomping furiously on the heavy armbit, tossing his massive head and fighting Bezier for every inch of Reen. He jogged in place, his hooves cracking against the frozen dirt road like pistol shots. Bezier sat deep in the saddle, her hands low, using her core to absorb his frantic energy. Her thighs ached fiercely within the first mile. Henry watched her from the corner of his eye. He was waiting for her to snap, to lose her temper, and yank the horse's mouth, but she didn't. She just kept a steady, unyielding pressure, talking to the beast in a low, rough murmur. They rode past the bare skeletal trees of the North Woods, cutting across the frost-covered moors. The wind was brutal here, sweeping down from the hills to bite at their exposed faces. "Where are we going?" Bezier called out, her breath pluming white in the air. "South." Henry replied, pointing with his leather riding crop. "To the boundary." It took them another 20 minutes to reach it. When they broke through a line of dead pines, Bezier saw it. The boundary wall wasn't a simple pasture fence. It was an old medieval remnant built from massive, uneven blocks of grey fieldstone. It stretched across the moor like a jagged spine. It was easily 5.12 feet high, completely solid, and covered in a treacherous layer of frozen dead moss. There was no forgiving top rail to knock down if a horse clipped it. If a horse hit that wall, bone would shatter. Henry pulled his bay to a halt about 50 yards from the stonework. Bezier fought Ruin down to a heavy stamping walk beside him. "There it is," Henry said softly. He wasn't looking at Bezier. He was staring at the grey stones, his eyes hard and distant. "The edge of Ashburn Land. It's massive," Bezier admitted, evaluating the approach. The ground leading up to it was slightly uphill, adding to the difficulty. "Who builds a wall that high on a moor?" "My grandfather," Henry said bitterly. He had a dispute with the neighboring earl. He built it high enough that a man on horseback couldn't even see over it. He wanted to make a point. Henry shifted in his saddle. The leather creaked. "I tried to jump it when I was 22, Henry continued, his voice dropping, stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. "I was full of pride and cheap gin. I had a hunter I thought could fly. I pointed him at it, and at the last second I hesitated. I pulled the reins, just a fraction of an inch." Bezier went still, letting Ruin chew the bit. She listened. "The horse caught the change in my tension," Henry said. "He stopped dead. I didn't. I went over his head, hit the top of the wall, and fell into the rocks on the other side. Shattered my collarbone, broke 3 ribs, and spent 2 days lying in the freezing rain before a shepherd found me." He finally turned to look at her. His dark eyes were bleak, holding a vulnerability he had never shown another living soul. "I bought Balthazar because I watched him clear a 6-foot hedge in Leicestershire without breaking stride," Henry said quietly. "I bought him because I thought if I owned the beast that could conquer this wall, it would erase the fact that I am completely terrified of it." He let out a harsh, self-deprecating breath. "I failed the horse, just like I failed the jump." Bezier stared at the Duke. She saw the heavy, suffocating chain of his own expectations dragging him down. He was a man trapped behind a wall of his own making, paralyzed by an old fear. Ruin snorted violently, plunging forward a step, his massive chest straining against the martingale. He was looking at the wall, too. His ears were pricked tightly forward. He wasn't afraid of it. He was sizing it up. "You didn't fail the horse," Bezier said, her voice cutting sharply through the wind. Henry looked at her, surprised by her tone. "You gave him to me," she said. She tightened her grip on the reins, feeling the immense coiled power beneath her saddle. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a wild, reckless rhythm. "You wagered 50 guineas I couldn't sit him for 3 minutes. I did." Bezier turned Ruin in a tight circle, walking him away from the wall to get a clear line of sight. The horse's stride lengthened immediately. He knew what was happening. The adrenaline spiked in his blood, hot and electric. "I'll wager you 100, Bezier said, turning back to face the Duke, her eyes blazing with a fierce, defiant light. "I'll wager 100 guineas that he can clear it. Today, right now." Henry's breath caught. He looked from her small, pale face to the towering, unforgiving stones. "Kelly, no. It's too high. The ground is frozen." If he refuses, he will crush you. He won't refuse, Bezier said. She gathered the reins, lifting herself slightly in the stirrups. The pain in her shoulder flared, but it was drowned out by the roar of her own blood. "'Cause I won't hesitate." Henry opened his mouth to order her to stop, to pull rank and forbid it. But the words died in his throat. He saw the absolute, terrifying clarity in her face. She wasn't doing it for the money anymore. She was doing it to break the ghost that haunted him. 100 guineas, Henry whispered, his knuckles turning white on his own reins. God help you. Bezier didn't smile. She squeezed her legs against Ruin's massive sides. "Let's go, you ugly bastard," she breathed, and she let the hurricane off the leash. Hooves struck the frozen moor like hammers on an iron anvil. Ruin didn't need to be driven. The moment Bezier slacked the heavy leather reins, the beast surged forward. The acceleration was terrifying. It wasn't the smooth, rolling, elegant gallop of a polished racehorse. It was the violent, piston-like thrust of a predator closing in on a kill. Every muscle in his massive body worked in brutal harmony, tearing up chunks of frost-hardened earth and flinging them backward into the icy air. Wind tore Bezier's battered felt hat away instantly. She didn't blink. Her eyes watered, the biting air slicing across her cheeks like shards of glass, blurring the edges of her vision. She kept her focus locked entirely on the jagged line of grey stone rushing toward them. The sensory overload was absolute. The sharp smell of crushed winter grass, the hot, metallic tang of the horse's breath blowing back in her face, mingling with the rank, heavy scent of his sweat. The rhythmic, agonizing jolt in her bruised shoulder with every massive, jarring stride. Henry watched from 50 yards behind. His bay gelding danced in panic, reacting to the sudden explosion of violence. Henry fought to hold his mount steady, his gloved hands totally numb, his lungs frozen. He was watching a suicide. The wall was too high, the approach too uneven. The takeoff ground was a treacherous slope of hard-packed earth and hidden rabbit holes. One misplaced hoof, one fractional hesitation, and a ton of muscle, bone, and iron would smash into the granite. He knew exactly what that sounded like. The memory of his own bones cracking echoed sickeningly in his ears. "Don't pull," Henry whispered to the empty air, the ghost of his own failure choking him. The words scraped raw against his throat. "For God's sake, Bezier, don't pull." She didn't. Bezier felt the exact moment Ruin locked onto the jump. It was a physical shift in the animal's tension. His ears pinned flat against his skull. His stride lengthened, devouring the yardage with a predatory focus. He wasn't afraid of the barrier. He was entirely furious. He was going to conquer the stones simply because it dared to stand in his way. 10 yards 5. Bezier grabbed a thick handful of coarse mane, buried her bleeding knuckles into his sweating neck, and stood slightly in the stirrups. She threw her heart over the wall and trusted the monster to follow it. Ruin collected his hindquarters. The massive coiled muscles beneath the saddle bunched together. He struck the frozen earth one final time, a sound like a cannon firing across the empty moor, and launched them into the winter sky. Gravity simply ceased to exist. The sheer violent upward thrust stole the breath entirely from Bezier's lungs. They kept rising. The air grew suddenly silent, the thunder of hooves replaced by the sharp whistling hiss of wind rushing through the horse's stiff mane. Bezier looked down. Beneath her right boot, the treacherous moss-covered top of the stone wall flashed past. They were clearing it by mere inches. She smelled the damp decay of the ancient lichen, a sharp, bitter odor of dead things. For one impossible suspended heartbeat, they flew. Then the world tilted violently downward. The ground rushed up to meet them. Bezier leaned back, slipping the heavy leather reins through her burning fingers, throwing her body weight far behind the saddle, to keep them both from somersaulting over his massive neck. Ruin hit the frozen earth on the other side. The impact was catastrophic. It shot straight up Bezier's spine, rattling her teeth, and nearly unseating her. Ruin's front knees buckled slightly under the immense force, his iron shoes scraping frantically against the icy rocks hidden in the grass. He scrambled, slipping dangerously to the left. Bezier lost her right stirrup. She slammed her elbow hard against his neck to anchor herself, her thighs gripping the stiff saddle flaps with agonizing, cramping force. "Up!" she screamed, her voice cracking raw in the cold air. Ruin snorted a desperate rattling sound. He dug his hind hooves in, found his purchase on the frozen dirt, and surged upright. He took 3 massive uneven strides to catch his balance, ripping up long strips of turf, then slowed to a heavy shuddering trot. Beja hauled back on the reins. Her hands were shaking so violently, she could barely grip the leather. Ruin came to a halt. His massive chest heaved like a bellows, thick white lather dripping from his neck flanks, and the heavy arm bit in his mouth. They were on the other side. Beja slumped forward, resting her forehead against the hot, sweaty curve of his neck. Her heart was beating so fast, it physically hurt her ribs, a frantic bird battering against a cage. She was laughing, but it sounded like a sob. It was a raw, ragged sound of pure adrenaline and miserable survival. She slowly turned the horse around to face the wall. On the other side, Henry sat frozen on his bay. He looked like a man who had just watched a ghost step out of a freshly dug grave. The wall stood between them, massive and impassable, but Beja sat above it, looking down at him. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile triumphantly. She just wiped a smear of dirt and sweat from her cheek, her chest heaving violently, and gave him a single stiff nod. Henry took a breath. It shuddered visibly in cold air, a plume of white smoke. The crushing, suffocating weight he had carried for a decade, the shame, the fear, the heavy armor of his own cynical detachment fractured. It broke cleanly in two, shattered by a half-starved woman on a killer horse. Steam rolled off Ruin's flanks in thick, ghostly clouds by the time Beja rode him the 2 miles down the jagged fence line to the rusted iron gate that connected the South Moor to the main road. Henry was already waiting for her. He had dismounted. He stood holding his bay's reins tightly, staring at the frozen, rutted dirt at his feet. When he heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of Ruin's hooves approaching, he looked up. Beja stopped the grey gelding a few feet away. She looked like a casualty of war. Her knuckles were bleeding again, the fresh red soaking into the clean linen bandages she had wrapped them in that morning. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the wind, her oversized coat torn at the hem, plastered with mud and horsehair. She didn't wait for him to speak. She kicked her boots out of the stirrups and slid off the saddle. Her legs gave out the moment her boots hit the frozen dirt. The adrenaline crash was absolute, turning her muscles to water. Henry dropped his reins. He moved faster than she had ever seen him move, closing the distance and catching her by the arms before her knees could hit the ground. His grip was bruisingly tight. He didn't let go even as she found her footing. He pulled her against his heavy wool coat. The smell of his expensive cedarwood tobacco mixed heavily with the sharp, acrid scent of her sweat leather and the horse's hot breath. "You are entirely out of your mind," Henry breathed. His voice was rough, completely stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. His hands traveled up her arms, gripping her shoulders. He was shaking. The Duke of Ashburn, who never raised his voice and never hurried, was actually trembling. "You could have died. He could have clipped a hind leg, broken his neck, and crushed you into the dirt. But he didn't," Beja said. She tilted her head back to look at him. She was exhausted, her shoulder screaming with fresh pain, but she felt incredibly dangerously alive. He jumped it. "I didn't care about the horse," Henry said harshly. The words hung in the freezing air, heavy and absolute. Beja stared at him. She saw the dark, frantic intensity in his eyes. This wasn't the bored nobleman who had told her to go to the kitchens. This was a man stripped down to his raw nerves. She swallowed hard, tasting the lingering copper of blood in her mouth. She wasn't used to men looking at her like this. They looked at her with pity, with disgust, or with cheap lust. But Henry looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing room. 100 guineas, Beja whispered. It was a defensive reflex, a cynical shield thrown up to break the sudden terrifying intimacy of the moment. She didn't know how to handle being valued. Henry let out a low, ragged laugh. It wasn't amused. It sounded like pure relief tearing out of his chest. He slid his right hand from her shoulder up to the back of her neck, his leather-gloved fingers tangling in her cold, messy hair. "I will pay you 100 guineas." Henry said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce murmur, his face inches from hers. "I will pay you 1,000, but I am not letting you walk away from this estate. You are keeping the job." "I'm keeping the horse, too," Bezier countered, her breath catching slightly as his thumb brushed the fading yellow bruise on her cheekbone. "He's yours," Henry agreed without a second of hesitation. "He always was." Basilia looked at his mouth. She didn't want a savior. She had spent her entire life fighting against the heavy hands of men who thought their money bought her obedience. She didn't want a lord, and she certainly didn't believe in fairy tales. But she wanted the man who had knelt in the muck and handed her the tools to survive on her own terms. She reached up, grabbing the heavy wool lapels of his immaculate coat with her battered, bloodied hands and pulled him down. The kiss was not gentle. It wasn't polite, and it wasn't sweet. It tasted of dirt, adrenaline, and biting winter cold. Henry wrapped his arms tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against him, kissing her back with a desperate, bruising hunger. It was an anchor dropped in rough seas. They were two highly cynical, severely damaged people who had spent their lives bracing for the fall, finally realizing they had hit solid ground. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, Basilia rested her forehead against his chest. The heavy, steady rhythm of his heart thumped loudly against her ear through the wool of his coat. Nearby Ruin snorted violently, tossing his massive head and yanking a mouthful of dead, frozen grass from the ditch, entirely unbothered by the humans. Henry let out a long breath, resting his chin on the top of her head. He looked at the massive grey beast, then down at the ruined, remarkable woman in his arms. "Tomorrow," Henry said softly, a trace of his dry humor finally returning. "You are going to teach me how to ride him." Basilia scoffed. It was a genuine, raspy sound that warmed the freezing air between them. "Tomorrow," she said, stepping back just enough to look him directly in the eye, her grin sharp and wicked. "We start you on the ponies, Your Grace. I don't need you breaking your neck and leaving me with the paperwork. If this story of grit, mud, and defiance made your heart pound, don't just scroll past Bezier." And Henry proved that the best romance isn't found in polished ballrooms, but in the raw, messy fight for survival and respect. We bring you gripping, grounded historical dramas every single week, packed with complex characters and real stakes. Hit that like button to support more stories like this. Share it with someone who loves a fierce underdog, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a wild ride. Drop a comment below. Would you have jumped the wall?